Seoul, March 4th, 2026. In an operations center at a South Korean LNG importer, a shipping advisory has just stopped being an advisory. The feed shows the Strait of Hormuz, closed, 20% of the world's natural gas, 18 cargo ships frozen in transit, no rerouting option, no backup terminal, no answer. The question is not what happened. The question is why the world had no answer for it, and why Qatar specifically had no way out. To understand that, you have to understand what the world actually built. The Strait of Hormuz, 33 kilometers at its narrowest, a two-lane shipping corridor barely wide enough for fully loaded tankers passing in opposite directions, carries 20% of the world's traded energy. Every single day, 20 million barrels of oil and virtually all of Qatar's liquefied natural gas through that single passage. Saudi Arabia has a pipeline that bypasses it. The Petroline runs 1,200 kilometers across the Arabian Peninsula to the Red Sea. The UAE has a second route terminating at Fujairah. Together, at maximum capacity, they handle under 5 million barrels per day, a fraction of Hormuz's daily flow, and they carry crude oil only. For LNG, there is no comparable infrastructure anywhere on Earth, no bypass, no alternate terminal with equivalent capacity, no contingency route. The strait is not one choke point among many, it is the only point. And that is not geography, that is a design. In 1971, geologists confirmed what seismic surveys had suggested. Beneath the waters shared between Qatar and Iran lay the largest natural gas field ever discovered. Over the next 50 years, Qatar built the most concentrated single-country LNG export infrastructure in history at Ras Laffan. 14 production trains, 77 million tons of annual capacity, supplying roughly 20% of all LNG traded globally. The concentration was deliberate and economically rational. Qatar's geology gave it a production cost of around $2 per million BTU, less than a third of what U.S. LNG costs to produce. Every dollar invested in a bypass pipeline was a dollar of price advantage surrendered to competitors. So, it was never invested. By 2026, the world had effectively outsourced 20% of its global LNG supply to a single industrial complex, accessible only through a corridor one adversarial government could close. The world had been here before. In 1987, during the Iran-Iraq tanker war, the United States launched Operation Earnest Will, the largest convoy escort operation since World War II, to protect Kuwaiti tankers transiting the strait. Oil markets spiked. The IEA convened emergency sessions, and the structural lesson was documented in reports, policy briefs, and academic analyses. The strait was a single point of failure, and concentrating more volume there would make the world progressively more fragile. The response was to continue exactly as before, because the alternative cost too much. In 1987, approximately 4 million barrels per day transited the strait. By 2026, that number was 20 million. The world had run the same experiment 5 times larger, with the same design. What came next would prove every one of those warnings right in 30 days. February 28, 2026. 880 coordinated U.S.-Israeli strikes hit targets across 24 Iranian provinces in 12 hours. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei is killed. March 4th. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps formally closes the Strait of Hormuz to all commercial shipping. Brent crude begins its climb, through $90, through $100. March 8th. Crude crosses $100 per barrel for the first time in 4 years. March 18th. Iranian missiles strike Ras Laffan Industrial City. 2 of Qatar's 14 LNG production trains are hit directly. Satellite imagery captures fires burning across the complex for 36 hours. March 24th. Qatar Energy declares force majeure on all long-term LNG contracts. The legal document does what no diplomatic channel has yet managed. It officially acknowledges there is no plan. The Cascade, From one military strike to a global force majeure declaration took 24 days. Brent peaked at $126 per barrel. Dubai crude hit a record 166. European gas doubled, 30 to over 60 euros per megawatt hour. U.S. retail gasoline crossed $4 per gallon. The IEA called it the greatest global energy security challenge in history, and the strait was still closed. Saudi Arabia has a pipeline that bypasses the Strait of Hormuz. The Petroline, completed in 1981, runs 1,200 kilometers across the Arabian Peninsula and can move up to 5 million barrels of crude per day through the Red Sea, bypassing Hormuz entirely. The UAE has a second, the Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline, handling up to 1.5 million barrels. These pipelines don't solve the Hormuz problem. The strait carries 20 million barrels daily, but they represent the logic of resilience, a road built before the main road closed. Qatar has no equivalent. There is no pipeline that takes Qatari LNG anywhere except through the strait. The reason is technical, economic, and political simultaneously. LNG pipelines require cryogenic infrastructure, fundamentally more expensive than crude oil pipelines. Qatar's gas field sits in the Persian Gulf with no viable overland route to the Indian Ocean that doesn't cross Iran, Saudi Arabia, or the UAE, each requiring political agreements that were never secured. And building a viable bypass would have required $70 billion in investment that would have directly eroded Qatar's price advantage. The asymmetry is not a coincidence. It is the product of every decision the global energy system made when it chose cheap over resilient. In Seoul, the Kospi fell 12% in 4 days. South Korea imports 89% of its crude via Hormuz and holds no strategic buffer large enough to absorb a multi-week closure. In Germany, 3 major industrial associations submitted a joint letter to the federal government asking a specific question: which factories would be identified for first shutdown under energy triage protocols? Not if, which. In Doha, Abu Dhabi, and Riyadh, Gulf states that import 70% of their food through the same strait they export their energy through. Grocery prices spiked 40 to 120% in 3 weeks. The Chokepoint controls supply chains in both directions. In the Gulf of Oman, more than 150 tankers sat at anchor, crews unable to proceed in either direction, waiting for a geopolitical negotiation that nobody knew how to start. 12 seafarers were confirmed killed or missing in IRGC interdiction operations during the first 2 weeks of March. They were not names in the energy security literature. They were just the first receipts for an architectural decision made long before they went to sea. And here's what makes this catastrophic rather than merely tragic. The IEA published its first formal Hormuz chokepoint assessment in 1974, 1 year after the Arab oil embargo. The Council on Foreign Relations, Brookings, and the Atlantic Council each published analyses between 2000 and 2020 explicitly warning that a Hormuz closure would be 5 times more damaging than 1973 because LNG exposure had grown from near zero to 20% of global trade. In 2022, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine demonstrated that energy supply assumptions could be weaponized overnight, several of those reports were updated and still not acted upon. In 2026, the IEA emergency response was a coordinated release of 400 million barrels of strategic reserve, a reserve built for crude oil shocks. There was no equivalent LNG emergency reserve anywhere in the world. Not one country had built one. This was documented. This was known. The twist is not that the warnings were missed. It is that the warnings were read, filed, and superseded by the quarterly earnings logic of the cheapest gas on Earth. Step back from the prices and the missiles. What the Hormuz crisis exposed is not a failure of military preparedness or diplomatic agility. It is a gap in system design. The global LNG market was built the way it was built because the people designing it were optimizing for cost, not resilience. Qatar's $2 production advantage per million BTU was real. The IEA warnings were also real. These two facts coexisted for 50 years, and the resolution was always the same. Cheap energy won. What the 2026 crisis changed is not the system. The system is still the system, but it changed the credibility cost of pretending the warning didn't exist. Every future discussion about where to site new LNG infrastructure, whether to mandate bypass redundancy as a condition of export licensing, whether to fund a strategic LNG reserve equivalent to the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve, those discussions now happen against the backdrop of a 30-day global cascade that cost the world economy an estimated $2.3 trillion in its first month. System design is a political act. The Strait of Hormuz made that visible. The only question left is what system the world designs next. As of April 2026, the strait remains closed. Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, more hardline than his father, and reportedly more open to nuclear weapons development, has added a demand no international negotiation framework can accommodate: recognition of Iranian sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, a position incompatible with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, under which every other international shipping corridor operates. Meanwhile, three things are accelerating that would not have accelerated otherwise: U.S. LNG export capacity, Cheniere, Venture Global, and 5 additional permitted facilities, is now on a government-expedited approval timeline. Renewable energy investment in Asia and Europe is running 18 months ahead of every pre-crisis projection, because every $10 rise in oil historically compresses the renewable cost curve by 2 to 3 years. And the conversation about a strategic LNG reserve, the SPR equivalent for liquefied gas, has moved from academic conferences to national budget discussions. The bypass that Qatar never built may become the template for the system the world builds next. Whether it does depends on whether the memory of 2026 outlasts the next quarterly earnings report.